I'm going to get us launched here into our panel discussion. And so with us, of course, is Dr. Stephen Nagel, who was with us this morning, of course, and Dr. Warheit, as well as Dr. Danielle Kroll. And so Dr. Kroll is also with the Food and Drug Administration and their Division of Drug Management. I might not be saying that right, am I? Okay. And so we brought Dr. Kroll in to round out our panel and to address questions. And so we do have some prepared questions. And then what I'm going to do is suggest that for questions from the audience, and I'll bet some of you do have some things, we're going to use a microphone here in the center, and you can step forward. But why don't we launch it off with questions, and I'm going to ask Rita Cox to come forward with questions. Rita is a member of the Two Life Board of Directors.
Okay, I won't pretend to be Mara, but I think I can handle this. So, thanks everybody for coming. I'm after the presentations this morning. I have a lot of my own questions, and I'm sure you do too. And hopefully, a lot of them will be the same. But we want to make sure that we cover as many as possible. One of the things that really stood out to me in the course of both presentations was the idea of implants and having them regularly or at some level being followed up on to ensure integrity and to watch for that. So based upon your experience, is there a guideline for how often we should have some level of screening for implant integrity? Are there signs that we should look for to ask for having it done? And lastly, who should we ask to have those tests done?
Sure. That's probably one of the most important questions that I would hope the audience would leave with answers to today. The first being the guidelines. The FDA does post on its website, and I placed up this morning in the presentation links to FDA guidelines for recommendations on screening, implant screening. So these are patients that have implants without symptoms. That's what screening is for. Once a patient becomes symptomatic, that's not screening, that's diagnostic. And just as this would be for any other entity, the difference being whether the patient is symptomatic or not. To skip to diagnostic, I'll let Dr. Warheit discuss that because there's a lot of clinical information that's important, but you would ask what are the signs and symptoms, and that would be generally a change, period, a change. Now, these are late onset changes, not within the first 6 to 12 months. As I said, 100% of patients after any surgery develop a seroma. A seroma is a collection of serum, which is fluid that leaks out of the tissues. It's made of water and protein. It's a natural part of surgical healing process. But these seromas normally reabsorb or resolve over 6 to 12 months. But the new onset of a late seroma after that time period is a clinical concern. Now, the patient may not notice it, but if your primary provider notices it on exam, that's a symptom. So that triggers you into the diagnostic imaging, which I'll let Dr. Warheit discuss. With regards to other symptoms, any other change that the patient or the clinician notices could be a swelling, a hardness, a lump. Very rare to have pain, and extremely rarely enlargement of the lymph nodes regionally, under the arm or in the area. So any change clinically is a symptom which triggers a diagnostic workup. And then again, with regards to asymptomatic patients that have no symptom, everything's fine, the FDA has recommendations and guidelines for screening. Now, the General Plastic Surgery the Devices Panel Committee in March of this year recommended that asymptomatic patients be screened with ultrasound. And I also have the privilege of listening to Dr. Warheit's recommendations with regards to ultrasound screening. But the links are up there, and I provided them for you so that you could look at the FDA recommendations and guidelines for screening of silent asymptomatic implants.
Thank you.
I think it's probably controversial on what people want to do with the implants. I think it's every 3 years, or after 3 years, and then every 5, roughly. Just anecdotally, I'm not sure we see that in our population of implants. We see, when I was putting this together for the talk, I realized how many implants we actually see. I never really thought about it, but we were able to accumulate long lists of patients with implants for me to try to find images to show. And I realized there are a lot of implants out there, but just from reading the MRs, I would think we'd see more MRs of looking for implant integrity if people were following those guidelines, and we don't see that. So I'm not sure what people are doing. Again, the screening and the diagnostic are two different issues. If there's as a change, as Dr. Nagel said, anything change, and you're going to know your breast better than anybody else, that if something is feeling different, changing in size, or anything will drive you to your physician, at which point, a diagnostic study can be performed. I always like to look at things as simply as possible. What is the simplest way we can get through this issue? And I would always start with a mammogram and an ultrasound. Those are the sort of the gold standards of imaging for us. They're easy to do. You can probably get one the next day. You don't need pre-approval. You don't have to worry about MR. You don't have to worry about it if you have metal all over the place, if you have 15 different hip operations. You don't have to worry about any of that. So I always start, let's start the easiest way, and you never know. I mean, I showed a mammogram this morning. A woman came in for a screening mammogram, and her implant was ruptured. She didn't even know. So you never know what you might find. But I think if you really do feel any change in the breast, that needs to be pursued. And the question is, who should you see? I would. You always have the option of the person who put the implant in. It could be 15 years ago, 12 years ago. The surgeon's retired, the practice is closed, so that may not work. I would probably start with the person you see most frequently, your primary care physician, your OBGYN, whoever you really see, whoever orders your mammogram every year. I would probably work with them because they're going to be a little bit more familiar with you than the plastic surgeon who you may have not seen, it was a decade ago. So I think it sort of falls into, if you're symptomatic. If you're asymptomatic, I guess I'm not sure how to really answer the question. I mean, there are guidelines. Whether people do it is another story. MR is getting pre-approval. You always have those issues. But if there's a concern, or at least if you're getting an annual mammogram, at least it was starting in the right direction on the screen. Again, you don't know what we might find. If you have a dense breast and you're getting an ultrasound also, then you're getting a second study. You probably can get an ultrasound approved, with an implant, worrying about integrity. So all that stuff can be worked out ahead of time, on the screening side.
One other question on the screening end and on the mammogram. So when you've had a mastectomy, by the looks of those screens, there looked like there was a lot more breast tissue than what is left behind when a mastectomy is done and you go through reconstruction and have implants. Is there really enough that you can do a mammogram? In my own situation, I've been told that I don't need them and they really can't do them. So that was new information.
Mastectomy without reconstruction? With reconstruction. We tend not to screen. I don't think there are any particular guidelines on that. We don't tend to screen the reconstructed breast, and I'm not sure there are really any guidelines on that. As far as I know, there's no recommendation out there to do that.
Yeah. So, speaking as a breast surgical oncologist, not as an FDA representative, we don't get mammograms following a mastectomy because a mammogram is an image of the breast.
Right.
And in a mastectomy, approximately 99% of the breast tissue has been removed.
Right.
And so there's no breast tissue present for imaging. However, imaging guidelines for patients who have had breast cancer are accessible through the NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Those guidelines are available to the public. And then through the American Cancer Society, acs.org. And then your provider will know the guidelines, but this is the practice of medicine. But short answer to your question is, there is no screening imaging for the ipsilateral mastectomy side. Of course, the contralateral side is subject to screening.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, just to
Yep.
tailgate on that, I had those two cases where both patients felt something. So I think it's important to be vigilant yourself, be proactive, I mean, you'll notice if there's any change. In that particular case, those two that I showed, they were both benign entities, but we have had, recurrent or new breast cancers on the mastectomy side. As Dr. Nagel said, 99% of the breast tissue is removed. It might be 97% on someone, but there's always some breast tissue left behind.
Right, so just to clarify, there's screening and there's diagnosis. Screening is for the asymptomatic patient.
Right.
Diagnosis if there's a clinical finding, any finding concern. And then there's screening for implants and there's screening for the breast.
Right.
And those are two entirely different issues.
Yeah.
Right. And as Dr. Warhead said, a beautiful image you showed, the MRs that are performed for implant assessment are different than the MRs that are performed for assessment of breast tissue. Totally different study.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I want to spend some time talking about the implants that have been recalled and the textured implants, because I know there's a lot of questions about that today. First off, how does somebody know whether or not their implants are some of the ones that have been involved in this recent news?
So the fact of the matter is, as you pointed out, in reality is that most patients that have an implant don't see their plastic surgeon who put that in. They move, they relocate, so does the surgeon. He or she may just retire or not be around anymore. So that information is generally obtainable when it's being put in. You're generally provided, and the American Society of Plastic Surgeons has practice guidelines. You're provided with the data on that device, a card, an identifier, a locator. And that's important information because this is a surgical device that's been implanted in you with the intent of permanent status.
Mm-hmm.
Now, again, the reality is that, a lot of people don't have the birth certificates. This is just reality. Now, unfortunately, without what's called a unique device identifier, these devices don't have such identifiers where the radiologist can image you and say, I can tell you exactly what you've got. That's a more perfect world that, hopefully we'll get to. So unless you have that information that was provided to you when your implant was placed, our guess is as good as yours. We can't tell you other than if the manufacturer has data on who that device was delivered to, that facility has data on who that device was implanted in. So that's the chain of information, okay? And then it's only certain textured models that have certain biogel type process that are affected with this concern.
So in essence, if you don't have your card, you just need to start with your plastic surgeon.
And if your plastic surgeon is not accessible, I'd go to the facility where your procedure was performed.
Okay. All right, good, thank you. Thank
Right.
you. So once you know that, whether or not yours was involved, you've been told, even though the recall has been issued, you've been told not to rush, not to worry immediately unless you have symptoms, watch for symptoms. Well, what are the things that we should be watching for before we move forward with getting more information and making changes?
Yeah, not coincidentally, I tell my patients the same way that Dr. Warhead told them. You know your breast, you know your body. If you've noticed a change, don't ignore it. Bring that change to your primary care provider. If you have your plastic surgeon available, that's the best person to go to because they are experienced and expert in assessing changes. It always starts with a history physical exam, and then it goes to diagnostic imaging. Now, be that as it may, any change is not too small to ignore. Pain, swelling, something's not right. I feel something different. And quite frankly, any change is the most common reported finding that there would be.
Okay, thank you. So these Allergan implants have a 10-year device warranty. Is this now going to have an impact on issues over payment for surgery if one of the implants is on the list, if you're past that 10-year warranty payment? Any indication on how that's going to go?
So the FDA is part of Health and Human Services. Our email address has fda.hhs.gov. And fortunately, for Dr. Cole and I, we're in the FDA, we're not in HHS. Part of HHS is CMS, who comes out with answers to payment. And it's a very difficult situation for providers to be caught between. We provide health care as oncologists and as radiologists and as surgeons. And we provide health care irregardless of a patient's financial status or insurance status. Patients are patients to us. Doesn't matter what the insurance is or if they have no insurance. We take care of our patients. Unfortunately, insurance companies are the ones that get to make the decision as to what they're going to pay for or not pay for. And then the final answer is up to not the surgeon, not the oncologist, not the radiologist. We do a lot of care that will never be reimbursed for, but that's not what counts. The answer to your question is I don't know, which is what the usual doctor's answers to most questions are. I don't know.
Yeah, just locally, I can't answer for anybody's insurance plan because I think within each plan it's different depending on the day of the week. It always seems, even when if I have an insurance question on my own plan and I make a call, I never get the answer I want. So I think you need to really check with the insurance companies and be your own advocate. I mean, just keep fighting. I always tell everyone that whoever answers the phone, the no is written on their desk, and that's their job, is to say no. That you just have to keep fighting, try to move up the ladder, ask for supervisors. I ask people what medical school they went to. You just sort of have to fight for yourself, and you don't always win. But the insurance coverage is always, it's always a problem. You just sort of have to, fight it out. I'm not quite close, but I'm not quite, on Medicare yet, so I can't address, how Medicare or the government looks at this. But, locally, I know it's always a fight.
Okay. So I do have some questions still to go, but if you have questions, start lining up because I'll pause for others at any point. If you can step forward to the microphone, please.
On the topic you were just discussing, if the surgery is deemed medically necessary, then it should be covered by insurance, correct?
As a human being, I agree with you.
Okay, well, I
As-
mean,
as a
also
physician-
by law.
As a physician, I agree with you.
Yes.
The FDA doesn't regulate
No, I
payment.
know, but
now, as far as I know, it's just being in clinical practice, Dr. Warheit phrases it beautifully. The answer changes not only from day to day, but it depends upon who answers that phone. You're going to get the final answer. It should be. The answer, yeah, you're right. It should be.
yeah,
right?
that's what
There's
I thought
no
it was with
beating
breast
around
cancer and
Right.
implants, that once they were in there, if it was medically
Yeah.
necessary to do something with it, that
Yeah.
was also required to be covered by insurance companies.
Yeah, it should be. Unfortunately, again, the reality is that depending upon who you ask, there's a different definition of necessary. There's a different definition of medically necessary. I have patients who need an MR for me to plan their breast cancer surgery out. They need it. And I can spend days on the phone trying to explain it to some pediatric ophthalmologist and it's just not going to be approved.
Yeah.
Okay? This is the world we live in.
I mean,
Pardon me?
do your homework, you
Oh,
know.
right. Always do.
Yeah, you know, and it's easy now. Google is great. I mean, be careful what websites you go to. Make sure they're reputable. But do your homework and be ready with the ammunition because you might need it.
I've never lost a battle with an insurance company, believe me.
Yeah.
I guess I should clarify a little bit why I asked that question, because if you're looking at having your implants taken out or replaced because of the recall, is that going to be deemed medically necessary by your insurance companies? And in that case, is Allergan going to step forward? So I think that's where I was going in case you start to have problems with an insurance company.
I have BRCA2 rather, and I have 4 sons, 49, 51, 52, 53, and they should be tested, correct? And when should the grandchild be tested? What age, the grandchildren? If my doctor said 2 out of the 4 boys should have some kind of BRCA as well.
So I'll answer it 2 ways, and
Okay.
neither of these are coming from the FDA. We're in
Okay.
this. We're in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and we're in the Oncology Center of Excellence, and we don't regulate testing for genetic predisposition. However, first, if you look at the American Society of Breast Surgeons website, they have a consensus statement recommending genetic testing for every patient affected with breast cancer, period. And I
I've
agree
had
with
that.
that completely.
I've had it, yeah.
Right. Now, for that patient that has the BRCA1 or 2 gene, there's a 50-50 probability
Yeah.
that their children have, you've passed that gene on to the children.
Yeah.
And so this is the reason to recommend consideration of testing for the children. However, it's not necessarily the same as recommending that the children have that test. And the difference between is this. You have to ask as a physician, clinician, are the results of this test going to drive its decision? And if the answer is no, then why are you going to have that test? Well, the knowledge may be your answer. And if that's a sufficient answer for the holder of that knowledge, then you're the one that gets to make that decision. But there's another consideration of, well, at what age should they have that test? Because intervention recommendations are based upon the age of the patient as well. So it's not such a simple answer as should they have the test. However, clearly they should consider that test based upon the 50-50 probability that they've inherited that gene
Okay.
mutation.
All right, so 50% of them will have it, 2 of the boys.
So one last thing. You don't just go and get the test. What you do is you go and get genetic counseling.
Okay,
So clearly, the short answer to your question is they should have genetic counseling,
Okay.
period. And it's not just breast cancer that's associated with certain genetic mutations. There are other malignancies that they may be at risk for as well,
yes, my doctor said
for
that.
which there may not be effective screening.
Yeah. And what age would the grandchildren be tested at?
Well, the answer is to first test
First
the
test, and if
first
they-
in line. So it's the
whoever has
patient
it,
and then the
if they want to
first degree
do it.
relatives,
Okay, all right.
which is not just children, it's first degree siblings as well.
Oh, I only have 1 left, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important that it's counseling that they go for first, because you really need to have the discussion of what are you going to do with the result, and that's what's really important, and that's where the discussion will be focused.
Hi. My question is about the implants. Back to, what is the difference between the textured and the smooth? And is the incident, and I don't remember whose slide, I think it was on Dr. Nagel's slide, there was a greater number of incidents of the BIA, LACL maybe, with textured implants than smooth. Is that just what was reported, or is there a difference in the implants themselves?
So Dr. Warr had a beautiful slide. I'm going to ask you
Oh,
for it,
sorry.
Andy,
Okay.
on a picture of a smooth and a textured. And the textured is just that. It's got a texture to it. And the smooth is just that. It doesn't have a texture to it. Now, to take it a step further, there's many different types of implants. There's so-called round, and there's so-called anatomic, and that's the shape of the implant. And each has its advantages and disadvantages. However, the texture will enable the implant to stay in place compared to with an implant without that texture. And if it's not going to stay in place, then there may be a need for a mesh product to fix it in place. Right. With regards to the risk of BIA, ALCL, breast implant associated anaplastic large cell lymphoma, it is greater risk in association that have been reported with textured implants compared to smooth implants. It has been reported with both. However, the information and preponderance of data is so greatly weighted towards the textured that there's a certain type of textured implant associated with the Allergan models, the so-called biogel models, that the recall was prompted in relevance to those particular models of textured implants and tissue expanders that use that same technology of texturing. Did I answer it? Or was that kind of like being a surgeon, just going on and
Maybe
on?
a little. I guess the bottom line is, it's just that there have been more cases that have been reported
Yes.
with the textured.
Yes.
So I have the smooth version of the recalled implant.
Right. So if you have the smooth version, nobody can tell you there's nothing to worry about because it has been reported in association with smooth.
That's
Here's
the
the
bottom
problem.
line.
Number one, nobody knows how many implants have been placed worldwide. There have been estimates of somewhere between 10 and 40 million. Nobody knows. Of the implants that have been placed worldwide, nobody knows how many were textured and how many were smooth. So to understand that incidence, you need to have a denominator and a numerator. And that data is unknown. However, the numbers of reports for this event in association with the textured implants are so strong in comparison to the smooth. And in many cases, in patients that have smooth, the prior history is unknown. So we can't tell you there's nothing to worry about for a smooth, but there's not enough data to support a recommendation for action on smooth based upon the information we have.
Okay, thank you.
I want to follow up on that real quickly. So the information that you have, where is that information coming from that allows you to
Sure.
issue the finding that you did?
Sure, great. So again, the FDA website has a section on BIA, ALCL, and we receive our reports from medical device reports that are sent in from patients, providers, and industry. But once again, those reports are not confirmed, they're not vetted, we don't know if they're accurate or not, and there's no relevancy with regards to association. But MDRs are the main source of information. Additionally, there's scientific information from real-world data. And real-world data reports from medical literature around the world. Now, again, those aren't MDR reports that are sent to the FDA that we study, and sometimes when we get them, we ask for them in additional information, which may demonstrate that they're duplicative or they're inaccurate. But in any event, real-world data is a great source of information that we receive. And then there's the registry information. There's the profile registry, which has been formed between the FDA in collaboration with the plastic surgery societies that collect this information on outcomes with regards to implants.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to make sure I understand this clearly. When you're screening for implant integrity. Does that screening also apply to the BIA, ALCL, or how you can't screen for that, or how do you? I don't understand how you determine if you are developing that cancer.
Yeah, imaging-wise, and actually we both had the image of someone with the anaplastic lymphoma. You'll develop a fluid collection or a seroma within the capsule. So it will be between the wall of the implant and the capsule. You'll develop fluid that is a new development of fluid. So that is the classic presentation of it. So if we were imaging, we would see the fluid. We'd see it easily on an ultrasound, MR for sure. mammography, maybe not, but you may get a feeling that there's something not right. So we would see that on a normal screening study. We have, like I said, we have 2 patients that we know in our practice that have textured implants that were asymptomatic, but through their plastic surgeon, we basically screened them for purpose of surveillance. One was completely negative, the other one had a couple little pockets of fluid. We were able to get enough fluid for analysis, and that was negative. So, I mean, that would be the only way if someone had some concern where they could have a screening study for us to look for that fluid. Otherwise, I'm not sure any of the cases have presented without that fluid.
Okay.
You know, they might be out there, but again, it's so rare, and the reporting process is really somewhat disjointed. You don't know, but we're going to assume that the fluid is the telltale sign for us. So just through a screening process, we could look for the fluid. And fluid shows up, it's great on ultrasound. You know?
And that would be early, and how would you determine an early stage of this particular cancer?
Oh, if there was fluid there and it was a new development, and we would aspirate as much fluid as we can get, and there's a whole litany of tests that will be run on the fluid that will help determine what's in the fluid.
So in 2 years, so you're saying screening every 2 years?
No, I'm not saying that.
No, not.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's any particular guideline
guideline,
on the
okay.
screening. I mean, we had these 2 patients, read the New York Times and, got worried, contacted their surgeon, and this is the process we're doing for the 2 of them. We're going to look at 6 months. 6 months always seems to be our magic number of following things when we want to follow something and not do something more aggressive like a biopsy. So we're putting them into 6 months, and we'll see either how either insurance puts their foot down, or we decide that nothing's really changed and they're asymptomatic. Maybe we'll put it out for a year. So I'm not sure we have anything particular in mind.
So there's a significant difference between screening, again, which is the asymptomatic patient. There is no clinical abnormality.
Right.
Once fluid is detected, that's no longer screening.
Oh, I understand. I was wondering how much can change from one screening to the next.
So
screening.
if you're asymptomatic and your screening MRI is negative, then a minimum of 3 years interval is recommended before the next screening, which would probably not be MR anymore. It'd be ultrasound. Once fluid's detected, the following of that finding is no longer screening, it's diagnostic. However, that fluid must be sent for very specific analyses to exclude the diagnosis of ALCL. And without those certain tests, the CD30 and the ALK, which are absolutely necessary to confirm that diagnosis, just looking at it under the microscope and saying, a regular, no malignant cells, that's not going to exclude ALCL.
Thank you.
So I have 2 questions. One, how long is a silicone implant, can I expect it to last? And as it ages, will it inevitably rupture or leak? Like, am I looking for the same symptoms? And the second question is this ultrasound versus MRI. You're all saying ultrasound is great. My plastic surgeon, oncologist, and imaging center all say, no, that's useless. It has to be MRI.
So
I'm gonna go right down
I'll let Dr. Warheit go into the advantages of MR over sono, but with regards to the issue of longevity, implants are not lifetime devices. I mean, they don't last forever. There's no way to predict how long any particular implant is going to last before it deteriorates. Be that as it may, there are implants that have lasted decades with no events. And there are implants that last far shorter with events. But one thing is clear, they're not lifetime devices. And it's not the likelihood of an event that's most important. It's the consequence of the event and the tolerance for that consequence that will drive decision-making process with regards to what to do with that implant.
There's no average, like you're saying decades. Decades seems like a long time.
Yeah.
Longer than I expected.
Yeah, that's the most common concern that patients have, and the reason is that we don't have that specific answer is because there's so many different implants. There's many different manufacturers, and within those manufacturers, there's many different models of implants. There's different fills of implants, and then there's different reactions to that material. So each case is an individual case, but no, we don't have. What we do have are rupture rates. And it was one of the links that I provided, which is a study called the CORE study, which looked at rupture rates for different models of implants. And if you go to that link, you can see the data that shows the rupture rates for different models of different implants and the time to rupture. So that may be somewhat informative, but it's not going to tell you about you. It'll just apply to the general population.
So I want to follow up on that one a little bit. We covered, I believe it was Dr. Warheit's slides, that showed some of the saline implants and what happens when they rupture and how the saline is absorbed into the system. If you have silicone implants and they rupture, what does that mean? What does the silicone do to your system?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. There are basically two varieties of silicone-filled implants. There's the older variety, which is still here today, and it's a gel. And then there's the so-called gummy bear type. The gummy bear type is more solidified. You can cut into it. In fact, I do it intentionally when I'm doing certain procedures. And it's not going to spill out into the breast. However, both the shell of saline-filled and silicone-filled implants is made of silicone. And that material does get absorbed into the system. You'll find it in lymphatics, you'll find it in lymph nodes, and you'll find it in the system. In some patients, that event is without symptoms. But in some patients, they have symptoms from that event. Everybody's different. Everybody has a different reaction to the silicone. Finally, if a silicone gel spills into the breast, with some beautiful pictures of that as well, I wouldn't go so far as to say beautiful, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use that word. It's just very illustrative of that event. It's a really unwanted event for the patient and for the surgeon. And that's something that speaks to not the likelihood of an event, but the consequence of the event. And so your decision-making process is driven by your tolerance for that event. Look, there's a beautiful golf course here in town, and I'll confess I'm a golf addict. And if I may be like that Caddyshack guy that's just about to break into the 70s and lightning strikes, it's not the probability. I mean, I'll chance to get hit by lightning's 1 in a million, but it's the consequence of that event will drive my behavior, which is generally based upon what my score is at the time.
Yeah. Just wanted to go back. There was the question about MR and ultrasound on the rupture. If I had my choice, I would love to see an MR on every one of those patients. You see the entire breast, you see the entire implant, you see the chest wall, you see lymphatics. You get a bird's eye view of what you want. Ultrasound, again, like I said earlier, I like to always start simply because the simple process of the ultrasound may give the answer without having to go to an MR, which could be more problematic getting done. So the ultrasound is very good. I have a couple of good examples of intracapsular ruptures of the implant, seeing discontinuity of the envelope wall, seeing silicon migrating. That's all great. The limitation of the ultrasound is you get a great image of what you scanned. So you get to cover a lot of the implant. You don't really see the posterior portion of the implant that well. So if there's a rupture posteriorly and it's intracapsular and it's small, you're not going to see that. Is that a problem? It may not. Over time, more and more may leak out where it becomes more intercapsular and you might see it the next time So the limitation of the ultrasound is that you may not see something that's more posterior or something that you didn't image. And whether that's a problem or not, I don't know the answer to that. The MR, again, on the other side, will show us, posterior walls against the chest wall, easily. I had some good examples of small leaks. You probably won't see that with ultrasound. Is it important at the very time we didn't see it? I don't know the answer to that. But ultrasound seems to be the easiest way to go. Certainly, I don't think the ultrasounds are going to be major insurance problems that an MR might be. Everyone, it was alluded to before, everyone can always get an MR, but it's the second one that could be really problematic getting. And we have that problem with people, even following on neoadjuvant chemotherapy. It used to be the standard, you got an MR, we'd follow it 6, 8, 10 months, depending on or how the oncologist was doing. We get another MR to see the size of the lesions. That has seemed to have gone away. We're following more and more of those with ultrasound. So getting the MR is going to be more problematic than the ultrasound. They're both good. MR is probably better. I would certainly start with the ultrasound, but I'm not always sure we see everything we want to see with the ultrasound.
Good, thank you.
Dr. Kroll, I was hoping that you could talk about the clinical trials and advancing them.
Sure. So just to kind of tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm here to kind of round out the panel today. I've been in practice now for about a year, been with the FDA for 1 year, so I do see patients in the hospital 1 day a week, and then my main job is with the FDA is I oversee drug development and breast cancer clinical trials. So, the focus of our discussion today being the implant-associated lymphomas, we didn't really talk about treatment of them, and just to kind of, just add a little bit of something before I get into the clinical trial work that we do at the FDA, being such a rare disease that this is, if you were to get this breast implant-associated lymphoma, the treatment itself is removing the implant and the capsule. Very, very rarely, not only is this a rare disease in itself altogether, but rarely does it ever spread outside of that. Okay, so I'm not so much going to talk about the treatment of that disease, but clinical trial work that we do at the FDA. Dr. Nagel works in the device side, so overseeing the devices, that they're safe, effective, the ones that are FDA approved and available. So I work in the Center for Disease Evaluation and Research, and what we do is we make sure that the drugs that are on the market that are FDA approved for a specific indication are safe and effective. And as with implants, we collect data on implants. We collect data with drugs. And, there's some drugs that have been on the market for years that we follow the data for, see things can arise. And then if we start to see certain signals of side effects, we will go to the company and ask for that data back, because if something new might be arising, we definitely make sure that we collect or ask the company to collect data from a whole and all the patients that are treated with this. So with clinical trials, I think it's really important to, to have discussions with your oncologist that, if you are maybe looking for drugs that might not be FDA approved, there's a difference between available and approved. Drugs that are, maybe you've heard accelerated approval or things that may be in clinical trial, those are investigational drugs. We do not have the data to show that they are fully safe or effective. However, they are in clinical trials collecting that information. So it's, we encourage, we are encouraging companies to expand enrollment. Enrollment criteria for clinical trials are so strict. And I think there's no reason why we should not have more patients getting access to drugs that are investigational, even though they may not be FDA approved yet. The FDA approval process for drugs is very lengthy. Can anyone guess the time from a drug goes from development in the lab until it's available to a patient? Anyone? Years. It is years from the time a drug is developed in the lab, going through vigorous testing on clinical pharmacology and such until it reaches a patient, and we have to find the right dose for the patient, and that's a very, very early stage clinical trial until the time that it's in a larger clinical trial where hundreds of patients might be accessing this drug. And then from that point, at the FDA, I mean, it's a lengthy process for us to review all of the data that is available. And what we're doing, I mean, I think Dr. Nagel did have a slide on Project Facilitate that is not related to the breast implant talk, but I will touch on that because it is there and it is available for you. And we are trying to spread the word about Project Facilitate because, again, we want companies to expand enrollment for patients. Why should the patient that is, perfect performance status but has metastatic disease? People have comorbid diseases. We have hypertension and diabetes. We might be on a variety of drugs. But why should just that perfect patient be getting access to the drug? We need to put these drugs out into the real world for patients that are really could benefit from them. So the one thing that we're doing is trying to tell companies, expand your enrollment. Enroll men into your breast cancer clinical trials. Enroll premenopausal women and postmenopausal women into these trials, not so selective. So with Project Facilitate, what this is if you have tried multiple drugs and there seems not to be many options left for your disease, this is getting patients access to these investigational drugs that are in clinical trial that you may not have met the criteria for enrollment into the trial. So again, we're letting you know it's out there, but this is a discussion that you'd want to have with your oncologist if you're not sure which way to go next in the treatment of your disease. Is there anything else out there, doc, that I can possibly try? Investigational drug use is an option, but again, the FDA doesn't regulate that. And I don't know if Dr. Nagel mentioned it earlier, but we don't regulate the practice of medicine. We make sure that drugs are safe and effective for use. And the idea of Project Facilitate is if a patient were to get a drug that's in a clinical trial, but not be enrolled in the trial, but use it as a compassionate use, we're able to collect data from that. And at the FDA, we really find that very important that we collect data from a clinical trial, but outside of that, it's very useful to have this safety and efficacy information. So I think drug development is stronger than ever. I think that there are excellent drugs on the market already, but also on their way to the market. And I hope that answered your question about clinical trials. But again, at the FDA, we're really I'm a practitioner as well, and when I have these conversations with the patients, in the office, we really want them to know that, with what we're doing at the FDA, you are our number one. We want to get you these drugs, and we want to get them to you sooner.
Thank you.
Just have a quick question. When an implant is placed outside the muscle and held with mesh, how can you tell whether or not the mesh is broken from some of the attached places, which I'm assuming is part of attached to the muscle?
There's two ways to show it. Clinically, there may be a herniation as the implant dislodges and the direction of the implant changes. So there may be asymmetry. It might, it doesn't fit right, doc. It doesn't look right. So there's a clinical displacement. However, the mesh may have a defect, and the radiologist can see it on an MR.
Yeah, you need an MR to see the layered mesh over it. I would say I haven't seen that many with the mesh. I'm not sure how many of the plastic surgeons up here use them. But you would see either the defect, or you might even see something herniating or moving a part of the implant through it.
So that's the only way you can detect it is through that's an MRI or an MR. I'm not sure what the difference is.
Yeah, it would be an MRI, MRI. It's the same study. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
My mesh broke. It was really noticeable.
There you go.
Boob changed by inches. I heard Dr. Nagel in particular say, or I implied from what you said, that you could benefit from more data. I'm wondering if we could help. It sounds like registries have started, but if we could do patient provided data into a registry. For example, I'm in a registry for genetic mutations, inherited genetic mutations. It's facilitated through a doc. But I think many of us, I'll speak for me, I would give my data into a registry, and I think many of us would be thrilled to do that because we could collectively figure out what data we should be collecting. We can do it through medical experts so that you get some kind of vetting of the data. And organizations like an Army of Women might be able to facilitate doing this. And I'm wondering if we could do this in collaboration with the FDA or other organizations.
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. We're partners. We can't do what we do without you. All of these organizations are absolutely necessary because I can tell you I was at a fellowship before these outreaches existed, and it wasn't what it is today. So the answer is yes. The plastic surgery societies and the FDA welcome collaboration to enhance data. And it's not just a matter of us reaching back to you if you submit a medical device report individually. It's a collaborative effort. So the answer is yes, absolutely.
So if we were interested in helping make that happen, like I'll put my hand up, who would I approach? Because I couldn't do that alone. I would need some medical collaborators.
Right. And so that's why the FDA collaborated with the Plastic Surgery Foundations to establish a profile registry to provide the facility and the work necessary to collaborate with patients. And I would start with contacting, and I can provide you with this information through the FDA and the Profile Registry, the American Society of Plastic Surgery, the entrance into these programs.
Great. Thanks very much.
Yeah, if you can send that to Melanie or somebody on the team, we'll disperse. Great. Excellent. Thank you.
I'm just a girl in an implant. And I should have known Deb and I would maybe have a very similar question, so I apologize if this is a little redundant. But as disconcerting as this whole recall is, and thinking about what might be happening with the implants that we're walking around with, it was very disconcerting to hear today about the lack of data. And in a world of big data, and in a world of artificial intelligence, where things around us are so amazing, and so amazingly relying on data, how is it that the FDA is in this position that you don't have the data? And what are you doing in a modern world to take the next step to make sure that you're taking advantage of big data and AI so that you are not in this position for the next recall or the next scenario like this?
Yeah. Well, your question and comment really hit home on this matter. And the reason we're in this position is because of incomplete information. And that's why we collaborated to establish the Profile Registry and the National Implant Registries to collect this data. So it's ongoing, but the next step will be what to do with this data. And the devil's in the details, and is to tease out which particular products and which particular devices and which particular drugs have safety signals. Sometimes it takes a massive amount of data to identify this information. The medical world is full of examples of drugs that appeared to be wonder drugs until enough people took them, and then there was a safety signal, the so-called phase 4 studies to identify unknown events that couldn't come out in a 30,000 patient study, a phase 3 study. You need 30 million patients to identify signals. But this is the answer as to why we've collaborated with the registries to collect this data prospectively. And again, it's a work in progress. Once this data is collected and enough data is collected, then additional safety signals can be identified.
But is this something that the FDA is really proactively thinking about how you're leveraging the brand new and emerging tools and resources that are around you that could really help you corral data? I mean, what Deb was talking about was how are you going to get that data, right? How are you going to get patients involved and get these registries? But I just want to make sure that you're employing the tools that are at our modern day disposal that could really help facilitate and expedite this kind of analysis of big data in ways that we haven't ever been able to do until the very recent times. I mean, when you look at the mapping of the Human Genome Project and how slowly that went for so long, and then how quickly technology was able to help expedite that kind of work. I would imagine that if the FDA could employ some of these more modern tools of big data and AI, that you could maybe really expedite analysis and uncover exactly what you said when you have these big data sets that uncover a concern that comes up in the phase 4 trial. I would think that we could arrive at those conclusions more effectively with the tools that we now have at our disposal.
Yeah, I just sort of have a comment. I don't work for the FDA. I would think that they're thinking along the lines you are, but I think some of the problems are, when I was putting this talk together, I spoke with one of my plastic surgeons who's 2 patients that we're monitoring, and I had a lot of pointed questions about textured implants because, truthfully, I haven't really been thinking about them. And I asked him about how many patients you have with textured implants. His answer was, I don't know, and he goes, there's been no data bank of that because it's never really been an issue or a problem. So the companies that make them, they probably don't even know, how many they've made or how many were shipped where without really digging into the bowels of their files. So he said unless he went through every one of his files, he wouldn't really know. But he could tell me if he went through every file. I don't think he was about to do that. And then, like we mentioned earlier, maybe the plastic surgeon's retired. Where are his records? Now you have someone who's had an implant 12 years, can't even find the plastic surgeon, has no idea what implant she has. She may not even know if it's saline or silicone. I mean, we can tell her, but she may not even know. So, I think that's part of the problem. It may not be that the FDA can't or doesn't want to do it, but there's no place to draw the information from.
Right.
And I think that's the...
Well, and I think that goes more to Deb's question.
Probably part of the problem.
Around trying to get voluntary compliance or voluntary participation. I guess I just wanted to make sure that we're leveraging tools and that we're thinking ahead about those kinds of things, so that, because this isn't going to be the only issue where having those sorts of tools would potentially make a huge difference. We seem to be at a pivotal turning point where those tools are becoming available and could really transform the way we track and manage things and understand data in a very accelerated fashion.
No, absolutely. I second your comment. We can always do better. That's our mandate. We have to, and that's our, on a day-to-day basis, what we ask ourselves. Two questions: what didn't we do that we should have done, and what should we do that we're not doing, and how can we do better tomorrow than yesterday and next year than we did last year? That's our job. We collaborate with these societies and with these registries to collect this data. Now, to the point, it takes a certain volume of data to demonstrate a signal. The onset of this entity occurs 7 to 10 years after the implant's been placed. Initially, when these implants were approved to be on the market, the concerns for individual patient privacy were a precedent. Now the data is being collected for patients that receive implants. It's going to take time. But we don't do this alone. Again, we do this in collaboration with the plastic surgery societies. We collaborate with medical societies and regulatory agencies from around the world. So then the next question is, what do we do with the data? And absolutely, once you attack big data and you organize big data and you have enough of it, then you can move that information forward to benefit patients.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up on what she said. I find it extremely difficult to believe that the manufacturers who do have all of these devices identified uniquely, they all have, at least mine is, that they aren't aware where every single one of these is and where they have been sold. I mean, I have a Toyota that's 12 years old that just got a recall on it, and Toyota knows exactly where everything that they sold is in the world, as does every auto manufacturer, because it's required by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, at least in this country, that they know where those autos are. It seems to me that Allergan and Mentor and all of these people probably also know who they sold these things to. It's not like they're selling them to Walmart and people are just going in and taking them off the shelves. They're probably selling them specifically to hospitals or to plastic surgeons. So my guess is someone knows every single one that has been sold and where it is, and it's simply a case of where we don't have any control over the pharmaceutical companies or manufacturers of many things. Is that probably an accurate statement?
Mostly.
Yes, thank you.
So the manufacturers know who they sold it to. They sell it to generally a facility.
Mm-hmm.
And the facility knows who gets it.
Mm-hmm.
So when a procedure is done in a facility, the facility has a record. And there's three major records. There's the operative record, which is created by the surgeon that placed the procedure. And that's called an operative report. Then there's an operative record that's performed by the facility. And that's got not the surgeon's information in it, but the healthcare personnel that participated in that procedure in the room. And then there's facility information, so that identifier information is not only included in the surgeon's operative report, it's included in the operative record, and it's included as a part of the facility record. Implants that are removed are supposed to go to pathology 100% of the time. There was a great question earlier about should, and supposed to doesn't always happen. But again, the FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine. So manufacturers know how many of a particular model has been sold, but we don't know, and there's no way to know, how many patients in the world have implants, how many have smooth, or how many have textured. However, we should, and going forward, that's why we've established these registries to collect this information.
Okay, thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes left, so there's plenty of time for a couple more questions before we wrap up.
Okay, I have a few questions for the medical devices. So when Allergan starts with a saline or a silicone implant, it gets approved by the FDA. There's possibly a long-term study that's done. But then when they change it to a cohesive gel implant, is there another long-term study done on that, or is that grandfathered in because of the prior study?
So that would be a part of the studies that are collecting information on any implant that's been placed. And this information will include the maker, the model, the texture, round, smooth, the fill, silicone, saline, and all the information that's specific with regards to the details of that implant device is included in the data that's entered into that report.
So there's long-term studies each time they develop a new implant?
So that's data in. So to have valuable information, you need quality data in, you need quality data out. That's the trick. If that patient isn't followed, that patient moves, that surgeon, isn't around anymore, that's the data out part when the event occurs. So when an event occurs, that's data out. Rupture, systemic symptoms, diseases. That data is collected when the event occurs. And that's the challenging part of these studies. So all of the information as to the details of that implant is entered in. But to collect it out is the challenge. And again, we can't enforce that events that aren't reported be reported. All we can do is try to work to improve the reporting.
Mine's not so much the reporting, but the approval of the device itself.
So the approval of the device is based upon the data that was provided to the FDA to demonstrate sufficient evidence of safety and effectiveness. So the implants are approved based upon this known data. Studies are done, And those studies are what's called pivotal studies, which require a certain number of patients and is an acceptable subject population, as Dr. Kroll alluded to. You can't have too limited a population if this device is going to be, or drug is going to be approved for that population at large. In any event, those pivotal studies should have a certain sufficient population and a sufficient number of subjects and followed for a sufficient period of time. However, Congress created something called the least burdensome rule, which means we can't make a manufacturer follow patients for 10 years before we approve their product. And this event, BIA ALCL, generally tends to occur 7 to 10 years after the implant's been placed. We will push it out in most cases to a year. Some cases we'll fight tooth and nail to push a study out longer. For example, approval of a drug to treat a cancer. Well, you need 5-year data and sometimes longer data to demonstrate effectiveness and safety profile for that product. But for devices, we generally have approved them based upon safety and effectiveness data that are a much shorter period of time than products that are used to treat a disease, such as malignancy.
So there's a chance that the cohesive gel implants that I have no long-term studies performed on them?
Correct.
Okay, so then my second question is, you said something about tissue expanders and related to the BIA ALCL. So what studies or what is known about tissue expanders and that cancer?
So the tissue expanders fall into a product called surgical mesh. And the safety and effectiveness data for surgical mesh use in the breast has not been studied by the FDA. And so the FDA has not approved those devices for use in surgical breast reconstruction procedures.
Okay.
So they're being used what's called off-label.
Okay.
And again, we don't regulate the practice of medicine. The practice of medicine for off-label use is generally based upon evidence that the medical societies gather and assess, but not the FDA for those particular mesh products for use in the breast.
Okay, and I have
Yeah.
one last question.
Yeah.
So I'm a breast cancer survivor. I've had, tissue expanders. So I had them in for, I think, maybe 4 or 5 months. Does your body automatically form a capsule around that expander? And then what happens when they take the expander out and put you in an implant?
Right. So that's the purpose of the expander, is to stretch the tissues to allow for enough volume to accommodate an implant. While the expander is in, the body will form a scar tissue around it, and that's called a capsule. Right. And the breast surgeon needs that scar tissue to hold the implant in place, so when they take the expander out, they leave that scar tissue there. They want that scar tissue.
Okay.
And they need it, so that when they put the implant in, hopefully they won't need to add a surgical mesh to fix it in place. The fact of the matter is, most of the plastic surgeons today do use these ADMs to help support, and it's based upon their own data that we've not been provided to evaluate, but it's the practice of medicine. It's a standard of care.
Mm-hmm. And then as time goes on, your body can form a capsular contracture around the implant?
That can happen. Scar tissue can contract, and that's a natural process of healing in some patients.
But is that your body's immune response to protect it from what the implant is in your body? And
Short answer, yes.
Okay.
The short answer, yes. The development of scar tissue is a process of the immune system.
And is that linked to breast implant illness?
So the breast implant illness is a term that some have used to describe symptoms that patients report as attributed in association with their breast implants. There is a reference to systemic type symptoms: rash, fatigue, memory loss, brain fog. There are a multitude of symptoms, mm-hmm. But the capsular contracture is not one of them. That's a local reaction to the implant. It's not a systemic symptom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, one more.
I'd like to go back to data collection. And where I'm coming from is I worked in hospital laboratory quality for 20 years. And I'm very familiar with JACO and New York State Department of Health, et cetera, et cetera. And I know their standards as far as documentation go to the surgical suites at times, because in the hospital blood banking we had issues with not incomplete documentation of list of expiration dates and model numbers, et cetera, some stuff that the blood bank was providing. Does CMS, which I believe is still in your section, or not in FDA, but in that area, do they have standards that refer to required documentation in regard to these implants, considering how many are being done out there? And if they don't, are they thinking about adding anything? Because when they do that, they would certainly have documentation that they could get to and use.
Yeah, that's a great concept that is based upon the reality of reporting. One of the databases that's available to the public is based upon Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services that document the number of procedures done by diagnosis code and by procedure code. So that's a source that the FDA and all societies use to mine data. And it's limited, of course, to that population that has Medicare or Medicaid. So, I mean, there's caveats. You know, it may not apply to the uninsured. It may not apply to the military. There's a lot of populations that it may not apply to. But you can extrapolate and make educated extrapolations based upon that data. Sure.
But CMS produces the standards that are overseen by JACO and whatever isn't. That is just not Medicare that they're looking at as far as adherence to their standards. They're looking at the whole entire hospital population. So it's not just Medicare patients.
So what they collect is, CMS collects is data on procedures done by a diagnosis code and by procedure code. In terms of standards, there's a wide range of regulatory bodies that have standards.
Right.
American Society of Radiology has standards. The FDA has guidelines. And, you know, these standards are identified by that particular society. American Society of Clinical Oncology has standards and guidelines. But, you know, each standard and guideline will vary according to the entity that holds those standards.
But if you want to be accredited by JACO or New York State Department of Health, you pretty much follow CMS standards. Am I correct?
I guess you better. You're not going to get paid, right?
Exactly, right. So to me, if they said you need to document what model was put into an individual and what its expiration date, or I use that number because I'm a lab person, but I know that's not, you know, whatever, that I would think we would have data automatically if they say you got to do this to be accredited in order to give us more information on this. I know that documentation is always an issue. I've lived long enough to know that. I know documentation isn't always perfect, but if the accrediting agencies went after them for those types of standards, I would think they would have some way of collecting the data.
Yeah, data collection is it's termed big data. Yeah. And the word big is used for a good reason.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. It's noon time now. This was fascinating. Thank you very much. Great questions, everyone. You don't disappoint in terms of bringing your mind and your tremendous talent.